So there's a lot of stuff going on in the world. Pastor Karen and I, we co-lead our son's 8th grade confirmation small group. I may have mentioned this before. This small group, these 11 kids are just in for it because they've got 2 pastors who lead their small group. But Karen was leading the group last Saturday. We typically alternate, or last Sunday, and we typically alternate. But she could just tell that there was something, just kind of a little off or weighing on the kids, and what they were expressing, and this is 13-year-olds, is they were just so weighed down by all the war going on all around the world. And so these are all kids who come from very, safe homes, comfortable, loving families, all of that, but clearly affected by the events around the world because they're aware of what's going on around the world. So they just took time to write down kind of their questions or their thoughts or their prayers to God, and just to be able to express that and put that out there. So I just offer that, and then this first little piece as perhaps to keep everything that maybe we're carrying in perspective as well. So it's not to say that what we're about is unimportant, but I think it's just so important for us to work to keep a healthy and faithful perspective on the concerns or the burdens that we carry. We're probably not worried about a missile striking us at any point today. Most of us know we're going to make it safely through the day. We know where our food's going to come from. We know we've got clothing. We know we have shelter. We probably have people in our life who we love and who love us. And so I know that for me, it's easy to get wrapped up in a lot of stuff. And a lot of people feel like maybe I'm the person to bring all their little stuff to as well. But I just want to make sure that we're willing to keep that perspective. So one of the things I came across, and really I think this is a time that, especially with a lot of the concepts that are in Enough, it's very practical sort of stuff. So for those of us who are very practical sort of people and kind of black and white in that way, there are either things that we'll really gravitate towards or feel very comfortable arguing against. So there's a lot of prose in Enough. So what I'm hoping to do is just tap into more poetry in our time together, because I think that's how the Spirit sings. That's how she comes among us and lets us know maybe what it's all about. So this is one of the pieces that I came across that I just think is worth sharing, that will hopefully help us keep things in perspective. So this is from a poem called What They Did Yesterday Afternoon by Warsan Shire. She's a Somali British poet. She wrote, "I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world, and whispered, 'Where does it hurt?' It answered, 'Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere.'" So we know that's going on. It kind of hurts everywhere. Which then, as followers of Jesus, we have the opportunity to decide, will we add to the hurt? Because that's actually really easy. It's really easy to add to the hurt, to threaten, to make people feel like they owe us something, whatever it may be. Or will we perhaps take counsel in Scripture when Paul writes, "Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near." Maybe that's what the world needs from us. It's a harsh world. I look across the faces here and I can tell you're carrying a lot. You've probably had a lot put on you. You don't need any more harshness in your life, probably. But how do we experience God's gentleness? How do we share God's gentleness with one another here and then take that out into the world? because I'm actually not interested in bringing all the concepts of the world in here. I'm much more interested in this community taking what God brings to us out there. So hopefully we'll be willing to let our gentleness be known to everyone. All right. So word of introduction. This is, again, like I said, I'm not going to do a book report, because if you want to read it or reread the book, by all means, please read it. It's a very easy, accessible read. And if you do read each chapter ahead of time, it's up to you. You can do it. You can even decide in your small group how you want to do it. Each week I'll include the questions that are in the chapter. So if you don't have a copy of the book, don't worry about feeling like you need to get it to get the questions. They'll be there. I'll have some other questions as well. And as your small groups, I've heard enough to know that your conversation goes in far more interesting ways than I could ever predict or hope to guide. So keep doing you. You keep doing you. So this is from Adam Hamilton. So he's the lead pastor at Resurrection United Methodist Church in Leawood, Kansas. It's the largest United Methodist church in the country for what that's worth. Interestingly, they built a new sanctuary in the last 10 years, and they built it smaller than their old one, for what it's worth, too. But anyway, maybe they had enough. He writes this in the introduction: when we choose to believe that life does not consist in the abundance of our possessions, but is found in relationships, in our faith, and in purposeful lives, we become like the seed that fell on good soil. We become liberated to live the life that God intends for us. And if anything, that's my hope, is that we experience some sense of God's liberation in our lives, that in engaging this, or really any other topic, that we feel liberated by God's good news in a way that we feel more empowered and equipped and maybe even brave enough to be who God created us to be, rather than just being who we assume the world wants us to be. So hopefully we can become a little more liberated to live the life God intends for us. So these are just we're being really creative. We're taking the chapter titles, and that's what we're calling each week. So it's essentially our table of contents. And so we'll start with week 1, when dreams become nightmares. So, and just as a way to perhaps have a guiding scripture for us throughout especially these 5 weeks, I want to offer Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5, which says this: So Jesus said, "Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but did not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." So this is just a word of encouragement for us to start by looking in the mirror, not by pointing fingers at others. Because it gets really easy. Again, the more tactical things get, or we assume that we've got it figured out. And that's why I think starting by looking in the mirror is always a good place for any of us to start. So, the title of this chapter, our theme, When Dreams Become Nightmares, it's based on the idea of the American dream and how what people assume to be the American dream, if they buy fully into that, pun intended, what often comes of that isn't anything that's dreamlike, but often something that's much more nightmarish. So first, what is the American dream? Well, enough offers that for most people, the American dream has to do with a subconscious desire for achieving success and satisfying the desire for material possessions. And you can talk in your small groups. I mean, how do you define the American dream? What is it about? What does it mean? Is it even a thing anymore? I don't know. But if you look at a picture like this with all these houses that clearly have all sorts of amenities in a very well-kept neighborhood, that feels like, hey, we've made it. We've achieved something. This is we're leaning into the American dream in some way. So I just want to share some, there are some statistics in this chapter, but I found some other ones as well to either update or further illuminate some of the ideas that are in there about kind of what comes along with the American dream. So this is what the average American single-family home square footage is over time. So going back from 1920 to 2020 is where so every 10 years to kind of have a data point. And now, this isn't the square footage of new builds. This is the square footage of every existing single-family home. So just think about that, because if it were just new builds as well, it would look, it would be going a lot higher to the right. So in 1920, the average American single-family home had about 1,048 square feet. The only time it dipped down decade over decade was 1950, was under 1,000 square feet, 983 square feet. By 2020, it was 2,426 square feet, the average square footage of an American single-family home. That's just data, all right? That's just data. Interestingly as well, the average household size, like how many people live in this square footage, right? I mean, then you can figure that out. So in 1940, for instance, when the average house was 1,177 square feet, there were 3.8 people per household. And so 3.8 people. In 2020, again, when it was 2,426 square feet, 3.1 people. So the square footage more than doubled. The number of people living in each home on average decreased by 20%. So those are just numbers. We can decide what those numbers may or may not mean, but perhaps an interesting conversation. Many of us, including me, our family, we've moved many times, and we've never moved into a smaller house up to this point in our life. So that's my own story as well. This chart makes sense. Here's another interesting little piece about consumer credit card debt. Earlier this year, topped $1 trillion. So that may be, I don't know if that's the highest in the world, but we're number one, maybe? I don't know, we're number one. We like being number one. So crossed $1 trillion. Interestingly, whenever there's a recession, it goes way down for any number of reasons. But again, it's kind of an interesting thing. This chart just goes from 2004 till about present day. And so that, the chapter again talks about debt load and those sorts of things and what that's all about. And anyway, I mean, you all remember layaway? I mean, I think he refers to that. Yeah, I remember I don't know why we're laughing, but yeah, we remember layaway. You go back at Kmart and you got the layaway booth, and then you get it after you pay for it, right? And we know that's completely turned around. So we get it first and then pay for it later. Which then, of course, if you think about that, what it does then is, I mean, it's our desire for instant gratification rather than the discipline of delayed gratification. But then it also just keeps kicking the can down the road. I mean, that's the interesting thing with that the folks in D.C. are dealing with as well. And what does it mean as a country to be indebted, and I'm not getting into all the politics of that, but it's just interesting how comfortable overall we are with that. And it's a very complicated thing. And this number is also startling because, a lot of us don't carry any credit card debt. And so it's very interesting then to think about what are the driving forces. So we actually know, and that's we have a partnership with RIP Medical Debt because people to pay their medical debt for these cumbersome bills that they've got for, because I hope I'm not being controversial by saying the healthcare system doesn't really work in this country. But get these bills, not because of elective things, but because of necessary procedures, and then put it on a credit card because they want to pay it back so they don't go into hock. But then I mean, we know what those interest rates are and everything else, or the stories of people because of their medical debt have to choose. Are we going to buy food this week or pay for that procedure we had? So there's lots of things that contribute to all of this. And one of the things that is suggested in the book, and here's another little bit from the book, is affluenza. And so it gets defined, the chapter defines it. I don't remember the source. It comes from someplace else. I think it was a PBS special. But defining this idea of affluenza and kind of the three pieces of the definition. Number one, the bloated, sluggish, and unfulfilled feeling that results from efforts to keep up with the Joneses. Now, if I ever find the Joneses, I want to ask them some questions. Like, how do they get so far ahead? Seemingly. So keeping up with the Joneses, and it's something we're all familiar with. And even if we think it's kind of a ridiculous thing to do, my hunch is subconsciously we're all caught up in it because the tidal wave is just that strong. I'm caught up in it. My hunch is we all are. Number two, an epidemic of stress, overwork, waste, and indebtedness caused by the dogged pursuit of the American dream. And number three, an unsustainable addiction to economic growth. I think about this as our addiction to more. Up and to the right, because that means more of this and more of that is always the right answer in a culture that's suffering from affluenza. That it's always more. And the way that anything is sustained is by having more. So it's very interesting to see in the workforce, and there have been more and more reports coming out. So like our vet won't do dental cleanings anymore. So because our dog needs to get his teeth cleaned because he's gross. But I mean, he's a dog. Have you seen what dogs eat? Yeah, exactly. So he needs his teeth cleaned. But they don't even do the cleanings anymore because they have too many clients because our vet had said there are about 10 openings for every one available vet. So they can't keep up with that. And there's other industries as well. Like there was an article about the airline industry, that there over the summer a rash of flight cancellations or delays because of kind of scheduling things, but then also they're shorthanded of people to work. But none of this is a surprise either because generationally we had baby boomers who then went ahead and had fewer kids. Because every other generation had gotten bigger and bigger, and then my parents' generation decided not to procreate as much. And so and then we know how age works and what people do, and you get to a season of life and you retire, and that's great. And people live a lot longer. So these things are all coming, but then the ripple effects come out because our entire system is built on more. That we want more and we want everything available to us. So none of this is a surprise. I mean, we'll probably act surprised at times, but it's kind of like when an economic bubble bursts, the population bubble, if it didn't burst, at least it had a lot of air let out of it. And so that's kind of it's a typical, it's something that we could have foreseen. And so it's interesting to think about what are the ramifications kind of across the board. If more is always the answer, what happens when there's less? Can we deal with that? Or what does even more mean? Or what kind of growth are we even talking about? Because that's the other thing too, our addiction to growth. We just think that's a good word. And I would just offer this, that growth is a neutral word. Just like Hamilton talks a lot about how money is neutral, what you do with it, So that's kind of an interesting point too, to think about that. But I think growth is a neutral word. because like there are some things like we'll get to the parable of the sower, and we want plants to grow. Like our community garden grew a ton of, not a ton, I mean tons and tons of, Sandy, how many tons this year?
I don't know, I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean the math is like, it's incalculable, it's so much. But that's good because people are fed and the hungry are fed and the food gets put to good use, and the people who steward that, the thing that they hate most is any spoilage or waste. I mean, it's an incredible ministry. That is growth that we can get behind, absolutely. If you have a cancer diagnosis and the word that comes back is growth, that's the worst thing you could hear. So growth is a neutral term. It depends on what's growing. It depends on what's growing. And so part of what our desire for more comes from is the idea of scarcity. We tend to have a scarcity mindset at times. So somewhat interestingly, I came across this book. It just came out. It's called Never Enough. So we're reading Enough, and I'm reading also a book called Never Enough. So it sounds like they're doing opposite things, but they're actually kind of saying the same thing in different ways. But this is from a journalist, Jennifer Breheny Wallace. The subtitle of Never Enough is When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It. So first I just want to tee up what the book is about and then share a little piece of it that I think helps inform some of the concepts that we'll be talking about here. And this is all about parenting and kids. So it's about the achievement culture that is set up for students, the achievement culture in which students live. So in the introduction, she writes this: for decades now, researchers have been studying how adverse childhood experiences, such as living in poverty or amid community violence, increase risks to a child's health and well-being. So that kind of makes sense for us, how if you grow up in a situation of poverty or a place where you're surrounded by violence, that has adverse effects on your development as a person. Those are things that will negatively affect you. In 2019, a national report published by some of the country's top developmental scientists added a surprising new group of children to our country's most at-risk youth. At-risk youth. Students attending what researchers call high-achieving schools, generally speaking, competitive public or private schools with high standardized test scores, are found to have, quote, relatively high levels of adjustment problems, likely linked with long-standing ubiquitous pressures to excel at academics and extracurriculars, the report noted. One expert estimated that 1 in 3 American students may be impacted by this excessive pressure to achieve. So it's interesting that students, not only who are in poverty and who are growing up in poverty or places affected by community violence, are considered at risk, but also students kind of on the other end who are immersed in a culture of this achievement culture as it gets defined, that those are also at-risk students. And so she writes this about scarcity, which I think gets into where we're headed here in this chapter. America's self-understanding as the land of opportunity rests on the premise of an ever-expanding pie, so to speak. Everyone can get a slice, and as long as the pie keeps growing, each successive generation can wind up better off financially than the last. But our collective self-image is due for a revision. Today, 2/3 of Americans no longer believe that a steady improvement over generations is a given. American parents worry that resources for their kids are becoming increasingly scarce, and the data supports their belief. White middle-class children who were born in 1940 had a 90% chance of out-earning their parents. For children born in the 1980s, however, the chance of earning more than their parents fell to 50%. In the past several decades, it's only gotten worse. Millennials, on average, have lower earnings, fewer assets, and less wealth compared to what other generations had at their age. As with status, scarcity lights up our minds in complicated ways. When we perceive that there are not enough resources to go around, our brains default to a scarcity mindset, a one-track fixation on what we lack that can cause us to miss the bigger picture. When essential resources like food and shelter were once constrained, the scarcity mindset served as an evolutionary advantage, focusing our attention on what was most important for survival. This same focus gets triggered now when we perceive uncertainty, such as when we think our child might not have a shot at a good college. We become more conservative, more controlling, and more liable to indulge other protective impulses like status safeguarding. So as neurotic as contemporary parenting extremes may seem, such behaviors are in fact instinctual responses to insecurity, whether real or perceived. The effects of money on feelings of scarcity are in some ways obvious. Money determines where we live, the schools we send our kids to, the enrichment we can provide them. But as researchers have discovered, it isn't just an individual's income that affects their parenting decisions. It's also the macroeconomic climate in which they live, such as the degree of inequality that exists in their country. This is why outwardly comfortable people in the upper middle class can toss and turn all night, feeling anything but. So I cannot recommend this book highly enough, especially if you're parenting, maybe if you're grandparenting, or maybe if your adult children are parenting. Certainly worth doing, because the premise is that what kids need isn't pressure to achieve. They need to know that they matter. That's what the research shows. Kids need to know that they matter. And when we're, as the church, at our best, I think that's what we communicate to, that we matter. I want to talk about storage facilities just for a second, to lighten the mood. In 1984, the country had 6,600 self-storage facilities. Last year, there were 50,000 self-storage facilities, totaling 2.3 billion square feet. They're at 90% capacity, which means they're building more. There's 7% annual growth. So if you want to get into a growth industry, storage facilities. Well, you got all this stuff. You got to keep it somewhere. You got to keep it somewhere. So again, I want to throw some poetry in. Poetry about storage facilities, huh? Well, how about this? We'll hear from Mary Oliver. This poem is called Storage. It's both in her book Felicity, then also this collection called Devotions. And so this is her poem called Storage. When I moved from one house to another, there were many things I had no room for. What does one do? I rented a storage space and filled it. Years passed. Occasionally I went there and looked in, but nothing happened. Not a single twinge of the heart. As I grew older, the things I cared about grew fewer, but were more important. So one day I undid the lock and called the trash man. He took everything. I felt like the little donkey when his burden is finally lifted. Things! Burn them, burn them. Make a beautiful fire. More room in your heart for love, for the trees, for the birds who own nothing, the reason they can fly. Storage. And I don't want to surprise anyone. Our kids may not want our stuff. So I want to talk about the parable of the sower. We'll hear it in worship this weekend. First, I'll just share the verses, a couple ideas, and then share some just brilliant words from one of my favorite theologians. So first, the parable. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on the rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen." So that's the parable itself. What I'll share in a moment then is Jesus' explanation. So there are these interceding verses where the disciples come and like, "Why are you talking in parables?" And Jesus kind of explains that. And then he does a little unpacking of this parable as well. And so here's just the other part of the reading. Here then the parable of the sower. This is Jesus talking to the disciples. "When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and is not understanding, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So just a couple little background pieces about the parable and about Jesus' day. So seed was very valuable in his day. It was, it was a very important commodity. So it was probably more valuable to his hearers than it is to us. Because, us, you go to the garden store like Menards and you get that little packet. I want to know who makes those packets and the machinery that you get a little, but they're like 8 cents. For seeds. So it was a lot more valuable in Jesus' day. Also, now I'm no gardener. Like I said, I can kill most anything except for weeds. But even I know that's not a very efficient way to plant, what the sower was doing. So that would also be a surprising thing to hear. Jesus explained in the parable that how the sower was going about sowing the seed. And so then, we kind of get to have the parable, and then we have this little explanation. And what's interesting, though, is, and this is, I want to share from Barbara Brown Taylor as we're finishing, from her little collection called The Seeds of Heaven. And she had a sermon called The Extravagant Sower. And she writes about how her usual response in hearing the parable was to focus on the second part about, being the good soil. Make sure you're being the good soil, which, of course, if you think about soil doesn't really have a decision in that, but, it's a parable, so we can play with that. But so she kind of even reflecting on her typical engagement with the parable was to say, well, what am I supposed to do? She writes this: "That was my usual response to this parable. I hear it as a challenge to be different, as a call to improve my life so that if the same parable were told about me, it would have a happier ending, with all of the seed falling on rich, fertile soil. But there's something wrong with that reading of the parable, because if that is what it is all about, then it should be called the parable of the different kinds of ground. Instead, it has been known for centuries as the parable of the sower, which means that there is a chance, just a chance, that we have got it all backwards. We hear the story and think it is a story about us. But what if we're wrong? What if it is not about us at all, but about the sower? What if it is not about our own successes and failures and birds and rocks and thorns, but about the extravagance of a sower who does not seem to be fazed by such concerns, who flings seed everywhere, wastes it with holy abandon, and feeds the birds, whistles at the rocks, picks his way through the thorns, shouts hallelujah at the good soil, and just keeps on sowing, confident that there is enough seed to go around, that there is plenty, and that when the harvest comes at last, it will fill every barn in the neighborhood to the rafters. If this is really the parable of the sower and not the parable of the different kinds of ground, then it becomes to sound quite new. The focus is not on us and our shortfalls, but on the generosity of our Maker. The prolific sower who does not obsess about the condition of the fields, who is not stingy with the seed, but who casts it everywhere, on good soil and bad, who is not cautious or judgmental or even very practical, but who seems willing to keep reaching into his seed bag for all eternity, covering the whole creation with the fertile seed of his truth. We would not do it that way, of course. If we were in charge, we would devise a more efficient operation, a neater, cleaner, more productive one that did not waste seed on birds and rocks and thorns, but concentrated only on the good soil and what we could make it do. But if this is the parable of the sower, then Jesus seems to be suggesting that there is another way to go about things, a way that is less concerned with productivity than with plenitude. And again, I think that key is liberation. How free might we feel if we're willing to trust that God provides enough? You know, it's not about God's provision, it's about our division. For instance, there's more than enough, I think the most recent statistic I'd seen, there's enough, the earth produces enough food for every living person, all 8 billion people, to have 3,000 calories a day. We don't need 3,000 calories a day, but the earth produces more than enough for what we all need to live. Yet we know that there are people dying of hunger still to this day. It's not about God's provision, it's about our division. And so if we're liberated by this good news, that the sower will keep sowing, that there is enough, and that we can be free not to hoard for ourselves, but to participate in that abundance, you know, that might bring about that those sorts of change in the world that the world so desperately needs. So hopefully we can hold on to those ideas of simplicity and faithfulness and generosity as we continue to be provided for by our abundant sower. So that's all I got for you. I hope you have good conversation with one another today, and we'll see you next week for whatever the title of chapter 2 is. Wisdom and Finance. There we go.